What if I told you that the shortest Bible verse holds deeper significance? John 11:35, the shortest verse in the Bible, comprises the two words Jesus wept. It highlights Jesus' human compassion and empathy towards the sorrow of others, signifying his deeper emotional connection with his followers. However, there is an unspoken reason for why Jesus wept. Upon hearing about Lazarus' sickness, Jesus responded with a wonderful statement in John 11:4. He said, "This sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God might be glorified thereby." So, he chose to stay where he was for 2 more days, as mentioned in verses 6 and 7. Afterwards, in verses 11 to 15, he said to his disciples, "Our friend Lazarus sleepeth, but I go that I may awake him out of sleep." Then said his disciples, "Lord, if he sleep, he shall do well." Howbeit, Jesus spake of his death, but they thought that he had spoken of taking rest in sleep. Then said Jesus unto them plainly, "Lazarus is dead, and I am glad for your sakes that I was not there, to the intent that you may believe. Nevertheless, let us go unto him." This declaration aligns with his earlier revelation in verse 4. He knew that Lazarus would succumb to his sickness, and he intentionally waited until Lazarus was dead and buried to go and resurrect him. As soon as Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him. Verse 21 says, "Then said Martha unto Jesus, Lord, if thou hadst been here, my brother had not died." While this seems to indicate some degree of lost hope on Martha's part, her succeeding statement in verse 22 reveals the deepest conviction that revived within her at Christ's presence. She said, "But I know that even now whatsoever thou wilt ask of God, God will give it to thee." All this while, her sister Mary Magdalene was still in the house, and she went to call her. John 11:32 and 33 declares, "Then when Mary was come where Jesus was, and saw him, she fell down at his feet, saying unto him, Lord, if thou hadst been here, my brother had not died." When Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and the Jews also weeping which came with her, he groaned in the spirit and was troubled. Just like Martha, Mary also believed it would have been better if Jesus were present before Lazarus' death. The Jews' lack of faith affected them, plunging them into sorrow that clouded their trust in Jesus' power over death. Though Martha quickly overcame it, Mary was still overwhelmed with grief and could not restrain herself from weeping. Was it too late for Jesus to act now? This is the most important question, as it unlocks the untold reason why Jesus wept. If Jesus was to be overwhelmed with grief of death, then this was the perfect moment. The sight of his close friend Mary and the Jews weeping bitterly was indeed the most sorrowful moment. Yet neither Christ nor even his disciples wept. Christ and his disciples often spent good time in Bethany with Lazarus' family, and it was naturally expected that his disciples, to whom he said, "Our friend Lazarus sleepeth," would have been overcome with grief as well. But the fact that none of them wept at the very moment reveals a significant truth. It shows that the disciples were convinced of Christ's ability to awake Lazarus. That which causes men to mourn over the dead is the pain of separation, which normally beclouds the hope of reunion. But in the case of Lazarus, that grief did not overshadow the hope of reunion. Lazarus was sleeping, and in a moment of time, Jesus would resurrect him. Verses 34 to 37 state that when Jesus asked, "Where have you laid him?" they said unto him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus wept. Then said the Jews, "Behold how he loved him." And some of them said, "Could not this man, which opened the eyes of the blind, have caused that even this man should not have died?" As they moved to the grave, Jesus suddenly wept. The Jews supposed that it was because of his love for Lazarus. Of course, John 11 verses 3 and 5 confirm that Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. He was both a close personal friend to them as well as a family friend. But while Jesus had deep compassion for them, there is much more to his weeping. The unbelieving Jews were incapable of grasping the true meaning behind his tears. Those were tears filled with great sorrow and deep grief than the world has ever known. So why did Jesus weep? Christ's tears were not shed for Lazarus, for he was about to call him from the grave. Instead, he discerned the true sentiments of the mourning Jews, realizing that for many, their outward display of grief was mere pretense, concealing their true feelings. Isaiah 53 verses 3 foresaw his sorrows and said, "He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and we hid as it were our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not." The ongoing experience of being despised and rejected by men was a constant source of sorrow and grief for Jesus. The heartbreaking reality that his own chose to hide their faces from him rather than receive him deeply wounded his human heart. So, the tears he shed reflected the profound sorrow that emanated from the rejection he endured. To confirm this understanding, let's now examine the second instance when Jesus wept. This occurred during his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, a glorious event typically associated with joy rather than sorrow and grief. Similar to Lazarus' case, this event did not seem to justify weeping due to the hope it carried. However, in the midst of such joy, the man of the moment was suddenly overwhelmed with untold grief to the extent that he wailed loudly. Luke 19:41 says, "And when he was come near, he beheld the city and wept over it." The Greek word kleio, translated here as wept, conveys the idea of sobbing aloud or wailing, indicating intense emotional distress. In contrast, the term wept in John 11:35 is translated from dakruo, which means to shed tears. These distinctions highlight the depth of sorrow, surpassing the sorrow at Lazarus' tomb. Nevertheless, both were profound enough to break the heart of the Son of God. As depicted in Luke 19:42-44, Jesus spoke with mournful tones, saying, "If thou hadst known, even thou, at least in this thy day, the things which belong unto thy peace, but now they are hid from thine eyes. For the days shall come upon thee, that thy enemies shall cast a trench about thee, and compass thee round, and keep thee in on every side, and shall lay thee even with the ground, and thy children within thee. And they shall not leave in thee one stone upon another, because thou knowest not the time of thy visitation." Christ foresaw the fate of Jerusalem with a prophetic eye, and in the vision of his destruction by the Romans after years of his departure filled him with great sorrow. Shortly, Jerusalem temple would be left desolate. The glory of God would depart from it, never to return. Yet his tears were not for the destruction itself, but for the reason behind it. Within a week, the Jews would solidify their rejection, condemning him to death and choosing a thief over him. Similarly, there was no cause for weeping in Lazarus' case. Instead, their sorrow stemmed from the condition of the people who came to witness his resurrection. The raising of Lazarus would intensify the Jews' hatred towards Jesus because it strengthened many people's belief in him. Jesus had to flee Jerusalem as a marked man, pursued by assassins. John 11:45-54 and chapter 12 verses 10 and 11 provide further details. Thus Jesus wept because he foresaw that some among the mourners, displaying hypocritical sorrow, would soon conspire to kill him and Lazarus, whom they had just mourned over. There is nothing more heartbreaking than being rejected by one to whom you have lavished unconditional love and endured constant loss. This mirrors the sorrow that God feels when humanity rejects his love and salvation despite all that he has done. The fact that he has exhaustively done everything possible, both as a man and as God, to rescue humanity from perishing, yet humanity continuously crucifies him afresh and puts him to open shame, deeply wounds his heart. After all that God has done for you in Christ, you still walk away from him like that?